Crank. I am a 7-year resident here in Edmonds, born and raised in Detroit via Silicon Valley. Now I'm here. I do a lot of different things in and around the community. By profession, I am the Chief Development Officer for a statewide nonprofit that serves persons with disabilities. That's just a fancy term for fundraiser. And I do a lot of volunteer work in and around Edmonds as well. I would say currently I'm the vice chair of the Edmonds Planning Board. I've been on the board for about 5 years now. I am also the chair of the Snohomish County Airport Commission, better known as Payne Field. And I've been on that commission for the past 3 years. And I'm also running for office again. So I'm trying to keep busy during all this time amongst other things going on in the community. So I'm glad to be here.
Like a quick introduction, but I was like, I want to talk to her. And it never happened. And then I was in your session at the Step Up conference, and I still haven't talked to her. And so, yeah, I reached out. It was just funny though, because everything you were saying in that session was also part of the reason why I wanted to do this conversation series. And it was mainly because like, I don't want to be like the resident Black person,
right?
For so many reasons.
Yeah.
But then when you were talking, it got me thinking like, okay, well, how do I use that to my advantage in a little bit of ways? And it all lined up perfectly because when you were saying that, I was in the works of like making this series and pitching the idea.
I'm glad that I was helpful. You know, when I did that session, I was like, this is the first time I've ever done a 2-hour anything. And to do it virtually. And I was just like, okay, I'm like, people can kind of come and go as they want. So I'm like, I need to make this interactive. So I was just happy to see people putting things in the chat. So I'm so glad. And yeah, I appreciated your questions and what you were putting into the comments with everybody else. Because like I said, I'm like, okay, that reassures me that I'm saying something normal, that I haven't just like gone off my rocker. And I think when I do my talks, I'm very cognizant of, even when I saw the other lineup of speakers, they were going to talk about these very specific things and they have all these studies. And I'm like, no, I'm just sharing me and practical me. And I think that's engaging, not because it's me, but I'm trying to be relatable so that no one else that comes in feels like they have to be up here with certain degrees and whatever to feel like that they can share and help others. It's just like, no,
Well, I'm letting you know you're super relatable for me. And it was one of those moments where you kind of do a little bit of self-reflection too, because I'm continuously in situations where I am, and I think I said this in the chat, where I'm either the only Black person or the youngest person in the room. And so I'm continuously feeling like I have to almost prove myself sometimes, or I'm explaining why something is what it is. And to your point, that's when I realized like, okay, it's my job to speak up for the things that I am seeing and I am noticing and I am feeling, because if I do not, nothing is ever going to be addressed.
Right.
But it was hard to learn that, because it's like, I never want to be like, I don't want you to come to me just because like I'm the only person that you know that's Black or whatever.
I'm going to tell you something now. You're going to relearn it over and over again. Because there's going to be some movement, and there's going to be like things are going to move along and grow. You're going to start getting to other things, and then you're going to find yourself back in that same position again with somebody else, hopefully not the same person, because hopefully they have learned and moved on. But it is a challenge, and I'm so grateful that you're sharing this with me. But I'll say at the end of it, it's, you know, you got to figure out how you can maneuver through the day, and in a way that makes you feel okay, not that makes other people feel okay. And that'll be hard too. That still might be a 10-year journey to get to that point. Because I'm always I am a serial people pleaser, but I found over the past couple of years, I moved out of that. I've kind of aged out of feeling like I got to make sure everybody else is okay.
So that I noticed that I'm still a people pleaser, but I've set a lot of boundaries now.
Yes.
And basically, I've learned how professionally and just in my personal life, how to set those boundaries for myself, but then also hold myself and others accountable for those boundaries. So again, with all of the things that happened like nationwide and locally, all of the challenges that we've had to basically go through together as like a nation.
Right.
Some of the boundaries that you've probably set or had to enforce around a lot of
enforce is the question, is the word.
So what, like, however you want to start with that, because I mean that's
okay. So here's what I'll say about boundaries. You don't necessarily have to be so there's a book I want to recommend. You don't necessarily have to be a religious person to get it. I'm not much anymore, but the book is called Boundaries. Actually, it's a whole series by Dr. Henry Cloud, and there's a whole series of it. It's like boundaries in dating, boundaries in this and that, but the general boundaries one is one that I found to be personally helpful to me when I first picked it up 10, 12 years ago, and I revisit it every once in a while. And what it teaches you is about kind of how to set boundaries for yourself without feeling like you're doing something wrong. So I think when we hear the word boundaries, it's like, it's a, bad thing. And it doesn't have to be that way. And so there's two types of boundaries that stand out for me that I try to exercise daily. One has to do with, fences versus walls. We don't have to put up walls, because you put up walls, nothing comes in and nothing goes out. So even if there's bad stuff going on inside, you have no way of letting it out because you've walled it in. So he talks about having a fence instead, and that fence has to have a gate. And you need that gate because you want to be able to open it up to let things out that don't need to be there in your life, but to also allow things in that you need. And once you have it, you can close the gate. And so I put that into practice as much as I can with going, I have to protect myself with those boundaries, but maybe I'm also protecting somebody else because maybe there's something happening here that doesn't need to get out to somebody else. The other boundary that I appreciate is the one where they talked about, being about responsibility. And it talks about how you can be responsible to someone, but not for someone. And what that means is that, I think this is what I do in how my Black in Edmonds series kind of started. It wasn't supposed to be a series. It just kind of went on because people liked what they were hearing and interacting with. But when I do that series, I feel like I am responsible to those that are going to pay attention to it, to those who are going to participate, that I create a safe space, that I am responsible for getting good information out to people. But what people do with that, I have no responsibility for. If someone hears truth about something, but then decides they still don't want to, acknowledge it or adhere to it, I've done my job. I can't internalize why they are not doing something or feeling a certain way. And so those are really the two boundaries that have sustained me and really, for the most part, sustained me through the pandemic. Is, what am I doing to be responsible to people? How am I helping people? But at the same time, understanding that I'm not ultimately responsible for any decisions or actions that someone else does.
In that same vein, like how do you basically, for the things that you are allowing in, how do you control, because sometimes some of those things can be triggering, yes. For you, on your own. So, but that doesn't mean you can always avoid it. So right. How do you manage that?
Whew, that's a tough one. And I think you have to manage it on kind of the day-to-day or the incident-to-incident. I think about most recently, the last Black in Edmonds series, which is really everybody now. We talked about mental health because May was Mental Health Awareness Month. So everyone that participated kind of talked about, from students to seniors, how do you maintain good mental health? How do you avoid certain things? And I specifically chose to have that conversation on May 25th. because that was the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And I knew that that was going to at least be triggering for me. It was probably going to be triggering for a lot of other people in the community, even though it might be, it ran the gamut of what people were feeling, whether it was anger, sadness, frustration, so on and so forth. So that was going to be a major day of triggers. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, I can manage that by at least scheduling the conversation that day, so that I have something to focus on and know that I'm going to be getting good things in that I can take, so that I'm not succumbed to the anger and the sadness of that day.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it really was. I ended up, I made a joke on this on social media, which was, I found myself in bed, and by 7 a.m. I had spent like $400 on Amazon. And I was just like, why am I shopping this early on a day? And I had to realize, okay, this is how you're projecting.
Yep.
And you're shopping because it's the thing that you can do. You can control this. No one can take this away from you. But I was like, okay, so clearly I knew at some point that this is what I was doing, which made me even more grateful that we had the conversation scheduled for later that day.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I've started to do is, when I know that I'm going to have a day like that, I started with a meditation.
Yeah.
And then later on in that week, whether it's the next day or like 2 days, I schedule a session with my therapist, because I realize that whenever I know that I'm going to have like a therapy session, I literally mentally prepare myself for it. But I also I let everything that I know that is bothering me, I acknowledge it, and I let it come to the surface in those sessions, so that together we can unpack it, and I let it go after that. And for the rest of the week, I literally, I focus on things that I have control over.
Right.
Like, I clean just to clean. My place is never really dirty. Like I love cleaning. And so I'll find myself cleaning, cooking, going on a walk, and controlling my time doing things that I enjoy doing, which also led me to getting back to working out, which I started kickboxing, as I told you at the beginning of this session, and that's even been better. Man, I didn't realize how triggering some things would be for me, but you can only break down and cry on Zoom a few times without it eventually catching up to you later on in the day as well.
I would just say, though, give yourself props for, even having a therapist.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And we talked about that in that last session too, is that there's a stigma among certain, communities and cultures that, therapy is for white people. You don't get to do that.
Right.
And so I'm glad to see that
a Black therapist is what I have too. And I felt like that was important.
Yes.